Hi, everyone. Welcome to the show. I'm Dr. Nicole, and today I'm answering a question from one of you. The issue of whether and how to talk about your own mental health challenges with your kids can be a sensitive one. There's no one right way to handle this, and the approach is going to be different with a developmentally young child versus a developmentally older child. In today's episode, I'm hoping to give you some things to consider and some ways that you can talk about your own mental health challenges and needs that are supportive for you, your kids, and your entire family. The specific question for today comes to us from Elena, who writes, "How do I talk to my child about my mental health issues? I struggle with depression and anxiety, both of which have been worse since the pandemic started. I know it impacts my child, but I'm not sure how much to say or whether to say anything at all. I don't want him to always be worried about me. I also don't want to give him problems by talking about these issues. I'd love your thoughts on how to address it, if at all." I'm really glad that Elena had the courage to ask this question because I think it's something that many parents wrestle with at one point or another, whether you've been diagnosed with a specific mental health condition or you just struggle with some symptoms at different times. We all do, right? And it can be tough to know how to communicate with our kids about what's going on for us in a way that is supportive and gives them information without making it their problem or without them, having some sort of, perhaps negative response to it. And so I think it is important to talk about. And there's several key points that I want to raise around this. The first is that when we share our struggles, our mental health challenges in a developmentally appropriate way, and that's key, and we'll talk more about that, we actually are doing our kids a favor by normalizing the fact that all of us as human beings have mental health struggles at times, that we all go through experiences and periods of time where our mood is lower, or we're really anxious and stressed about things, or we're struggling to regulate ourselves, or we're having issues managing our own anger, or whatever it might be. By talking about that, we're normalizing it for them that this is part of the human experience. And that actually is so important for kids, because when adults don't talk about these things, when we sort of keep all of this hidden or we keep it a secret, we send the message unintentionally that these are not things that we all deal with, that these are things to be embarrassed about, these are things to be ashamed about, that if you're struggling with any of these things, that, wow, that is really abnormal and that's not something that you should let other people know about. And of course, that's not how we want to raise our kids to think about these things, right? We want them to be willing and able to come to us, to reach out for support, to communicate when they're struggling. And the way that we help them do that is actually by modeling that ourselves when we're struggling. And, taking away the stigma of these kinds of challenges, symptoms, diagnoses, by putting it out in the open and talking about it, and by being honest about it, again, in a way that is helpful to kids, but shining a spotlight on these very real things that we deal with as adults and as parents is actually really important for our kids. So I think that's, in the big picture, what I would like all of you to take away from this episode today, is that by hiding the things that we're going through, by not talking about it, by not engaging in conversation about the struggles that we're facing in our life, we're actually teaching our kids to do the same, which is unhealthy and not what we want for them. So another piece of this is that kids inherently know when a parent is struggling with something, whether we explicitly say it to them or not. And I think that's important for us to remind ourselves of, right? We don't need to sit down and have a conversation with our child about the fact that we're feeling depressed for them to know that something is not quite right with us, right? Kids are very attuned. Even kids with more severe neurodevelopmental disorders, kids who maybe seem unaware of things that are going around them a lot of the time or with other people. They know, they feel it. It's in the environment, right? It's in the environment of our relationship with them. When we're having issues with depression or anxiety or anger or whatever it is that we're struggling with. It seeps into all the parts of how we are relating to our kids and the parts of, everything that's going on in the home. And so kids know, even if we don't tell them. And that's why I think it's really important to give them factual information, because if we don't, we're leaving them to their own devices to create stories in their mind about what it is that's going on. And those stories are very likely to be inaccurate and probably more damaging for them. What often happens, and I've seen this in working with kids of all ages over the years, and even in working with adults who, when we start to really dig into it, recognize that some of the stories they have about this stuff started when they were young and their parents were struggling. Kids tell themselves all kinds of things like, my mom is, really sad or really angry or, obviously having a hard time. It must be my fault. That's very common for kids to go to a story like that in their mind. I must have done something. It must somehow be related to me. Now, as an adult, we think, well, that's ridiculous. Of course, my child didn't cause me to have some depression or whatever it might be. But we have to put ourselves in the minds of a young developing child. They are looking at the world through the limited capacity that they have and the limited experience they have for understanding the dynamics of people and feelings and interactions. And so, of course, they create all kinds of stories. It could be about, it being my fault, which is a common one. It could be my mom or dad doesn't like me. They don't love me. It can be all kinds of things. And so when we aren't clear with them about what's going on for us, again, in a developmentally appropriate way, we leave them to their own devices to try to make sense of what's happening. And that often is much more problematic for them, both in the short term and the long term of their life. So they know that something's up, and we owe it to them to have a conversation with them about that so they have accurate information. When we're thinking about how to talk with kids about this, I love to use the imagery or the idea of a mental wellness spectrum. Now, again, we wouldn't necessarily use that term mental wellness spectrum with, a 4-year-old. We certainly would use it with, a preteen or older. But this idea that at any point in our lives, we exist somewhere on this mental wellness spectrum. At the two extreme ends, we've got, at the one end, very severe, debilitating symptoms of things like depression, even suicidality, severe, debilitating anxiety, obsessions, anger, whatever it might be. And at the other end of the mental wellness spectrum, we have really awesome well-being. We're feeling, like we're managing things well. We're feeling positive about things the majority of the time. So we've got these two extremes, and then we've got all of this in the middle, which actually is where most of us are most of the time, right? Somewhere in between those two extreme ends of this mental wellness spectrum. And why I think it's really important to help kids and ourselves think about it in that way is it gets us out of this black and white mode of, if you're having some kind of mental health symptom or challenge, there's something wrong with you. And the people who don't have those things, there's not anything wrong with them. And that's really problematic, because the reality is that all of us experience mental health issues, mental health symptoms, things that even would rise to the level of some type of diagnosis at some point in our lives. That's just a fact. That's part of what it is to be human. And so I think when we approach it this way with kids, of helping them understand that, look, we're all human beings. We experience things in our lives that impact us in different ways. We have physical health issues that impact us in different ways. Our relationships impact us. And so we move along this spectrum of mental wellness all through our lives, and to give them examples of how maybe that has shown up in their life so far as a child, and to give them examples for you, and to talk about it as, right now, here's where I am on that spectrum of mental wellness. I'm struggling more. I'm having a harder time feeling positive about things. I'm feeling a lot more exhausted, or, I'm feeling a lot more worried about things, that I'm having a hard time getting my brain to not focus on those worries all the time. So that's where I am right now. But that's not where I'll be forever. And we all have the capability to move along that spectrum. And so I think to help kids think about it in that way is really supportive for them, both in understanding what's going on with you, but also in understanding themselves and their own mental health challenges and needs and experiences as they go through their lives. Now, in talking about this, you can use diagnostic labels or not. If you have, been for, professional evaluation or treatment, and you've been given a diagnostic label, and that resonates with you, and you want to use that label with your child, that's great. Go ahead and do that. Using labels like depression or, anxiety or OCD or, whatever it might be, that's fine to use those labels with that. It's also fine if labels don't resonate with you, or if you'd rather not use labels in your discussion of it. That's either way is completely okay. Now, when we think about how to do this in a developmentally appropriate way, what we're talking about is tailoring the language that we're using, the length of the discussion, the amount of information and detail that we're providing to the child's developmental level, to their ability to understand what we're talking about, their ability to process and make sense of it, their ability to handle the information. And it's not necessarily according to their chronological age. You know that I talk about things in line with developmental appropriateness, because and developmental age or developmental stage, because many of you are parenting kids who chronologically may be one age, but developmentally may be a younger age in one or more areas. And so we want to think not just about, well, this is a 13-year-old, so what do 13-year-olds understand? But we want to think about, for my child, they might be chronologically 13, but what is their capacity to understand language, to process emotions, to, all of those things. So you want to think about what is appropriate developmentally for your particular child. For a young child, we would keep it, very simple and very brief, using simple words. It could be something like, mommy sometimes gets really sad, and sometimes it's hard for me to help myself feel better about things. So I need some time alone during the day to help myself. So it's not that I don't want to play. Sometimes I will play, and sometimes I need to go into my room and listen to my music or take a bath or whatever it might be, so that I can help myself, because I just feel sad sometimes, and that's what I need to do. Okay, simple. Sometimes I feel sad. This is how I need to take care of myself. That lets them know. It acknowledges the elephant in the room that the kid, even at a young age, recognizes, which is, oh, mom's having a hard time. Mom seems to feel sad. It also gives them facts that it is not about them. This is a problem mom is having. And in fact, you can be clear about that. I'm not sad about you. This is something I'm dealing with. And so it takes that off of their plate, and it tells them that you're handling that for yourself, which is important. With a preteen or a teen, we can obviously have a more in-depth discussion at that developmental level, talking about it as, I sometimes feel really depressed. I struggle with depression some days, and sometimes I feel more positive with my mood than others. I can't always predict when or how that's going to happen to me. And when I am in a more depressed place and feeling more depressed, I feel really sad about things, even if there isn't anything specific to feel sad about maybe in that moment. I feel really tired. It exhausts me to have, these depressive times, and it just feels like everything's really hard. And that's not about you. That's something that I'm dealing with. And I just want you to know that. And I also want you to know that I know how to take care of myself and in those times, and that I, need to have some time and space to focus on those things. So, you might notice that sometimes after dinner, I go into my room by myself for a little bit. And what I'm doing is listening to some meditation audios that are helpful to me. I'm, taking a bath, I'm reading. Those are things I'm doing to help myself. Maybe you've noticed that, I have an appointment on the calendar once a week. That's my appointment with my therapist, where I go and get professional help to support me with this. So that gives you a flavor of how you can talk with a developmentally older child about that. Now, a few key things here, no matter the age or developmental level of your child. Number one, make sure that your child knows that what you're experiencing and dealing with has nothing to do with them. They did not cause it. They are not the source of the challenges that you're dealing with. That's really key, because kids 9 times out of 10, in my experience, will go to that story in their mind, as I mentioned. So making sure that they know this is about you. This is not about them, and that they're not responsible for causing this. Or if you, have been going along fine and existing in a better place on that mental wellness spectrum for a while, and then suddenly you start to struggle and you're more on the struggle end of that spectrum, that there's nothing they did to cause that to happen. That's really important for them to know. Also important for them to know that these kinds of symptoms and conditions, especially if you're using a specific diagnostic label with them, that they aren't contagious like other illnesses or viruses. This is especially important in the era of COVID that we live in, where younger kids especially can be very hypervigilant and tell themselves a lot of stories about catching things and things being contagious. But in general, even before COVID, it's important for kids to know that mental illness conditions, symptoms are not things that we catch like a cold going around. And so they don't need to worry that they're going to catch depression or catch OCD or, catch whatever it might be for being around other people that have those things. It's an important thing for them to understand. Also really important for them to understand that you have the proper supports in place for yourself, and that it's not their job to prevent you from having symptoms or to take care of you. Now, most parents, when I talk with them about this, go, well, of course it's not my child's job. But again, we need to put ourselves in the minds of kids. They often take that on. I know many of you listening, if you grew up with a parent who struggled with some mental health issues, diagnosed or not, maybe can reflect on this and go, yeah, I remember being a kid and feeling like it was my job or my responsibility to make sure that my parent was okay, or to provide support to them or to help them. So this is something that comes up for kids, and we want to be clear as their parent that we can take care of ourselves, that we love them and we love that they support us, and that their love and their connection to us is so beneficial to us, and we appreciate that. And that's our job as the adult to take care of ourselves, not them. And that means that you do need to make sure that you have the appropriate supports, treatments, whatever it is that you need to have in place to address the issues that you're dealing with, that you do that, because it is not your child's job to support you. If you're struggling with depression or anxiety, it is not your child's job to make sure that they are managing their behavior and their emotions in a way that doesn't trigger you and doesn't make your symptoms worse. That's not fair. And that happens a lot without us realizing it. We don't intend for that to be the case, but when we reflect on it, we go, oh man, yeah, actually, I do sort of have that expectation. Kids in their growing up years need to be allowed to have all of the feelings, all of the experiences, and all the behaviors that come out of that. And we can't expect them to not be real normal kids with those things just because we're struggling. So it's our responsibility to take care of ourselves, to make sure that we have the support systems in place, the therapies in place, the self-care strategies in place, whatever it is that's needed, and making it clear to our kids, in doing those things that I am taking care of me, and that's not your job. I think that those are some of the key things to keep in mind that you want to make sure you communicate. And those can be communicated, again, really briefly and simply. And I think the first time you raise this with kids, it's important to leave the door open for further conversation, to not feel like, well, okay, we had that conversation about my mental health, now we'll move on, but to let them know that you are open to any questions that they may have at any time, that you want them to feel free to come to you if they have questions or concerns, if they ever want to talk more about this, to leave the door open. A lot of kids may not have much to say about it in the moment, but they may have some questions or some things that come up over time, and you always want to make sure that you have left that door open for them to come to you with those things. Super critical. And periodically check in with them. Let them know how you're feeling, how you're doing. Just say, I want to check in with you about that. We had that conversation. I just want to let you know, here's where I'm at now. And any questions that you have for me or anything that you want to share with me around this, and to just check in periodically. Again, doesn't have to be a big deal, doesn't have to be some serious sit down conversation, but just continuing to put it out there is helpful, because it lets them know that this is something that's a normal part of life. You're open to it, to having conversations, you're comfortable with it, and you want them to be as well. So again, when we talk about these things, when we give kids this information, when we put this out in the open of our relationships with them, we provide a really important model for them about how to talk about their own issues and challenges, both now as a kid, as well as when they get older. And it makes it more likely that if and when they are struggling with these kinds of things, that they will communicate, whether it's to you or someone else in their life, that they will seek help. And boy, is that a gift to give our kids, right? So that's the big thing to keep in mind. Our kids always benefit from honesty, from factual information, and from support around these things, no matter what the issue may be. So you can never go wrong if you're approaching difficult, sensitive topics like your own mental health issues from the standpoint of providing them honest, factual, supportive, developmentally appropriate information. So I hope this is helpful for Elena and any of the rest of you who are trying to figure out ways to talk with your child about your own mental health challenges, your own struggles. Remember, if you have a question you'd like to hear answered on a future show, email it to support@drbeurkens.com. Thank you, as always, for being here and for listening, and I will catch you back here next time.